So with that, I want to now invite and briefly introduce our guest speaker, Ramachandra Guha. So there's there's innumerable stories about the name changes. The stories about how Feynman went to give a talk in some department, and the chair of the department got up to introduce Feynman, and everybody in the back of the audience, somebody's like, everyone knows Feynman, but who's the guy introducing him, right? Introducing Ram always feels like unnecessary. Ram is our foremost historian. Of the environment, his connections to CES go all the way back to his work with the work that he did with Madhav Gadgil and the books they wrote together. And because of that relationship, Ram spent a lot of time in CES, and therefore many of us got to know him personally. And we in the department, those of us who were there, were fortunate enough to meet him then and have known him then now for decades. What I loved about the breadth of work that Ram did was it wasn't just environment, it then moved to history. Many of you have read his books about Gandhi, but then it also extends to cricket and sports, and so this huge canvas of his writing and interests has always been an inspiration to me. On a personal note, every book that I've published has invariably involved Ram introducing me to someone in the publishing house. So I often joke that Ram's been a mentor, being a historian, a cricketer in his prime at one time. But I think of him as a rather distinguished bouquet. So, Ram, with no further ado, please.
Thank you, Karthik. I'm deeply honored and gratified to be invited to speak at this symposium in the last session. As Karthik said, I've been associated with CES, actually from before it began, but I'm feeling pretty sentimental today because it is almost certainly, never say never, almost certainly the last talk I'll ever give at the Indian Institute of Science. And the reason for the sentiment is that my association with this great institution well predates the founding of CES, well predates my birth. It began 100 years ago. I tried to check with an uncle of mine who wasn't sure of the exact year, but it's either 1925 or 1926, so 100 years ago, my maternal grandfather joined the institute for a master's. It was then called, he was an associate of the Institute of Science. He went on to become India's most distinguished wood scientist. For those of you who are military buffs, he helped design the mosquito bomber in World War II, the only wooden plane. And after retirement, he's virtually died. He had a lab in aerospace, and there's now a medal named after him in aerospace. His name was D. Narayana Murthy. That was my maternal grandfather. My father did a PhD in the Institute of Science in chemistry, where he was of the same cohort as the legendary G.N. Ramachandran. And my first visit to the institute, which I remember, was 50 years ago, in 1975. I was a second year undergraduate in the university, not studying science, which is a different story. And a family friend in Dehradun had a son who had done a master's in the Institute of Technology in Kanpur in chemistry with people like C.N.R. Rao and C.V. Seshadri. And this friend's son wanted to do a PhD and asked my father for an introduction to GNR. So I came here 50 years ago. I mean, I may have come with a little boy, I don't remember, with my father. And we knocked on GNR's faculty house. And he opened the door and he looked at my father and said, Ramdas Guha. He had probably not seen him since 1948. So it's in some ways, it's a deeply, as I said, personally sentimental moment for me. And Karthik has talked about my association with MADA, with CES. Many of the people here I've known from when they were PhD students. But let me move from the personal to the historical and to the subject of my talk. So I'm going to give you the talk is called, Karthik wanted something snappy. So it's called From Chipko to Climate Change. I left out the subtitle, which I shall share with you now. A history of Indian environmentalism and environmental debates. Now, the history of Indian environmentalism can be divided broadly into three distinct phases. The first phase, which runs from the late decades of the 19th century till independence, consisted of a cohort of precocious thinkers, individuals writing in the decades before independence, who argued in different ways for India to adopt a model of economic development more attentive to ecological realities, though they may not have used the word ecological, natural realities, the natural constraints, than had been undertaken by the West. Many of them were inspired by Gandhi. And Gandhi was someone who was a kind of an intuitive environmentalist. He famously said that if God forbid that India take to industrialization after the manner of the West, if it does, it will strip the world bare like locusts. And I think China and India may indeed be stripping the world bare like locusts. Gandhi also said, in one of his statements in the 1920s, that England and America, Europe and America have conquered all the continents. What is left for India to conquer, which one can understand as India having to live within its own spiritual but also material resources. Now, Gandhi, as I said, was an instinctive environmentalist. But there were people in this first phase of Indian environmentalism, whom I've written about in my book, Speaking with Nature, who were much more focused. The urban ecologist Patrick Geddes, who wrote about how to make Indian cities habitable. The agricultural scientist Albert Howard, who were early and precocious critics of chemical agriculture. The sociologist Radhakamal Mukherjee, who talked about integrating natural sciences and social sciences. And 100 years ago, wrote an essay in the American Journal of Sociology called An Ecological Approach to Sociology. So that was the first phase of a cohort of thinkers whom I've written about in my new book, Speaking with Nature. The third phase is the phase we are living through now, which is that of climate change. And the talk is called From Chipko to Climate Change. And I'm not going to talk about the first phase at all. You're most welcome to buy my book, where you'll get, I hope, a richly researched intellectual history of that first phase. You'll meet some characters whom you've never heard about before. You'll meet some characters whom you heard about, but not in the context of environmentalism, Rabindranath Tagore being one. I will just briefly allude to climate change in the last portion of my talk, but it's really about Chipko and onwards is what my talk is about. Because what Chipko did was it took Indian environmentalism, which was in the realm of ideas, Tagore and Gandhi and scientists like Gabriel Howard and, naturalists like M. Krishnan writing into the realm of activism, and social activism. And this period of social activism, non-violent social activism, which carried on from Chipko through other social movements, which some of you know about and which I may briefly describe, what they did was to generate a very widespread environmental debate that highlighted the ecological and social costs to India and to Indians of what I call imitative industrialization, and urged instead an alternative model of environmentally sustainable development. Now, so Chipko is an event, and I don't need to say, I'm sure many of you know about Chipko, so I won't say anything about it in detail, except to remind ourselves that it was a movement of peasants, men, women, and children in the Garhwal Himalaya against the social and environmental dislocation caused by reckless commercial felling that began in 1973. I want to say a little bit about its significance in Indian environmental history. So, first of all, it decisively refuted the canons of orthodox social science, in which countries like India, or Brazil, or Kenya, or Vietnam were believed to be too poor to be green and not supposed to have an environmental consciousness. Now, in the year 1980, the MIT economist Lester Thurow remarked, if you look at I'm quoting, it's a direct quote, Lester Thurow, an MIT economist, writing in 1980, I quote, if you look at the countries that are interested in environmentalism, or at the individuals who support environmentalism within each country, one is struck by the extent to which environmentalism is the interest of the upper middle class. Poor countries and poor individuals simply aren't interested, end quote. Now, a wiser economist, the Nobel laureate George Akerlof of Berkeley, speaking in a different context, when was asked to define his profession of economics. And he said, an economist is someone who, if you show him, and it was usually a him, if you show him something that works in practice, he will answer, but does it work in theory? Right. So the theory told you that poor countries and poor individuals are not interested in environmentalism, but the practice was there through Chipko 7 years before Lester Thurow's magisterial dismissal that countries such as India could have an environmental consciousness. So Chipko was an environmentalism of the poor, which demonstrated the inseparable connection in the Indian context between sustainability and social justice. Many of the participants, as I said, were unlettered. The leaders, however, though from peasant backgrounds, were informed and extremely articulate about wider issues. The two most celebrated leaders of the Chipko movement, again, one name at least will be familiar to you, that of Sundarlal Bhagwala. The other name, which is less well known, but in my view much more significant in the history of environmentalism, is that of Chandra Prasad Bhatt, who wrote essays in Hindi on tracing the direct links between industrial forestry, soil erosion, landslides, and floods. And these essays by Chandra Prasad Bhatt showed that what at one level was an economic conflict between the subsistence demands of peasants for fuel, fodder, medicinal plants, etc., and on the other side, the commercial motivations of paper and plywood companies, these had deeper ecological implications as well. One last thing about Chandra Prasad Bhatt, who's still with us, he's 90. His autobiography has been translated into English under the lovely title, Gentle Resistance. So I urge that also on students to buy. He's still with us, he's turned 90 this year. But I say, the context of the previous panel, which talked about the importance of community mobilization. Now, Bhatt is and was an extraordinary visionary. So he directed, organized, conceptualized the first Gandhian non-violent movements to stop commercial tree felling. Those succeeded in halting the kind of clear-cutting of natural forests in Himalaya, the conversion of mixed broad-leaved oak pine forest to monocultural stands of conifers and so on. But then he said this is not enough. We must revegetate the barren hillsides. And from the late 70s, he started organizing biannual eco-development camps, where his group, the Dasholi Gram Swarajya Mandal, extraordinary individuals, absolutely committed grassroots workers from a Gandhian background, started mobilizing village women and children, and occasionally men, to revegetate these hillsides. And a decade after these eco-development camps were started, a student from the Institute of Science, a student of Madhav Gadgil called S.N. Prasad, went to study, did a comparative study of plantations run by the Uttar Pradesh, they were Uttarakhand then, Uttar Pradesh Forest Department, and the plantations done of indigenous saplings by the Gandhian, grassroots Gandhians of Garhwal. And he found that the survival rate in the Chipko camps for plantations was 75 to 80%, and that in the forest department plantations, 10 to 15%. Now, this is kind of Chipko's significance. It was an environmentalism of the poor, combining sustainability and social justice. At this interweaving of sustainability and social justice was also manifest in other grassroots struggles of the 1970s and 80s, such as the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which many of you are familiar with the struggle of traditional fisher folk in Kerala against overexploitation by trawlers, in some of the anti-mining movements in Orissa and so on. And all these movements showed how the energy and resource-intensive model adopted by the Indian state from the 1950s had devastated local ecologies as well as widened social disparities. So that's the foundational importance of Chipko. Now, let me say a little bit about, from a comparative lens, if Chipko was the foundational event of Indian environmentalism, what was the foundational event of American environmentalism? And the answer is, of course, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which is not only a work of good science, it's a beautifully written work. It's a work of literature. In fact, not long ago, about a few years ago, I was asked to recommend the two most important popular scientific books of the 20th century. And I recommended John Maynard Keynes' The General Theory of Money, Prices, Money and Employment, and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Now, Carson's book was the catalytic event that brought the dangers of unbridled industrialization and consumerism to a wider public attention. Silent Spring was to America what Chipko was to India. And here's a significant and important difference. In America, science spawned policy and legislative change. Whereas in India, and the person from MOEF is here, the causation was the other way. There may have been no Ministry of Environment and Forest without Chipko. Indeed, there may have been no CES without Chipko either. So science spawned social activism in America. In India, social activism spawned science. And actually, Madhav Gadgil was an early visitor to Chandni Prasad Bhatt's eco-development camps, and he will speak about Bhattji in tones of reverence, adoration, respect, only slightly less extreme than mine. Because I wrote a whole PhD on him, so you grant me my kind of excess of emotion. So that is what Chipko meant. It was really a catalytic event. And it led through the 70s and 80s to the flourishing of very important environmental organizations in India. The previous panel mentioned quite a few in Bangalore, apart from CES, A3, NCF. But outside Bangalore, if I may mention two, that again owed their birth really and owed their birth to Chipko, though their flourishing had independent motivations. One is a Center of Science and Environment in Delhi, started by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan. The first article in the international press on Chipko was written by Anil Agarwal in the year 1975. It was published in the magazine New Scientist under the title Gandhi's Ghost Saves the Himalayan Trees, with Gandhi spelled Ghandi, which was not Anil's doing, it was the sub-editor in London. Another very remarkable organization, which I think deserves a full-fledged history and is not often talked about in these panels, which owes its birth to Chipko, was Kalpavriks, which is still alive and active and which has spawned, dare I say it, almost as many brilliant ecologists as CES and some very brilliant social scientists as well, and activists and lawyers and so on. Right. So I cut my teeth as a scholar of the Chipko movement and what I call the second wave of Indian environmentalism and owe a great deal to it. But nonetheless, there was one significant weakness in the environmental debate in India as it unfolded in the 70s and 80s. You know, the decades that saw Chipko, the birth of CES, the founding of Center for Science and Environment, the founding of the Department of Environment and Forest that became a ministry and of course now has climate change. And the weakness was this: it's anti-urban bias. You know, many of the most remarkable things in environmentalism, both the technique of protest, the moral core and integrity of the activists, the empathy with the poor, came from Gandhi. But so did this significant weakness, because Gandhi famously said, India lives in her villages, but of course it has always lived in its cities too. And Gandhi himself, as Karthik said, I'm a biographer of Gandhi, so just an interesting kind of fact about Gandhi. Gandhi is entirely shaped by towns and cities. He was born in Porbandar, which is on the Kathiawar coast. Then he went to school in Rajkot, which is a town inland. Then he studied in the great imperial metropolis of London. Then he came back to Bombay, another great metropolis. Then he goes to South Africa, where he practices in Durban and Johannesburg. And he's absolutely shaped by the cities, but he turns his back on the cities, because he believes the real India lives in its villages. But India has also always lived in its cities. I mean, we had an ancient urban civilization, going back to the epics and Hastinapura and Ayodhya, and coming down to the great cities of Mughal India, Delhi, Ahmedabad, and of course on to Calcutta, Bombay, etc., and Kempegowda's Bangalore thrown in. And this anti-urban bias was extremely significant and noticeable in the activism and not just activism, in the scholarship of the 80s and 90s. And I once joked, only half facetiously, that the Indian environmental movement is a debate in the cities about what is happening in the countryside. Because, all of us thinkers, sociologists and historians and economists and ecologists were working in the cities, though we were doing some of our field work in the countryside, and we completely neglected. Collectively, as scholars, activists, community builders, scientists, we completely neglected what was happening in our towns and cities, even as these were growing extremely rapidly. Okay, now, so much for Chipko and what it spawned. A radical transformation in the environmental debate happened after the onset of economic liberalization. Now, liberalization was in many ways overdue. It has led to enormously beneficial effects. It has nurtured a climate of entrepreneurship. It has raised rates of economic growth. It has reduced mass poverty. And of course, it has solved, when I was young, there was an endemic foreign exchange crisis that is now more or less gone. But it has also had a massively negative impact on the environment. The Himalaya, the Western Ghats, the tribal areas of central India, which are really internal colonies for the rest of us living in the cities, because we draw so much from it and leave only destitution, dispossession, degradation in that way. But liberalization, even as it was bringing these positive benefits economically and even socially, and even as it was destroying the environment, it was not just a physical destruction of the environment, it was an intellectual, ideological delegitimation of the environmentalism of the poor. The attacks on environmentalists in the mainstream press in Delhi were brutal and savage. In the early, young people here won't know it, but I was following it. In the early 90s, early 2000s, it is a new coal plant a chemical factory, a large dam that is going to displace 100,000 people. Only the environmentalists ask questions, right? And meanwhile, the activists themselves, after struggling for 2 decades, had grown old, weary, tired. The media, responding to the call of their advertisers, had stopped covering environmental issues. In fact, in the 1980s, when I was a college student, every Indian newspaper had an environment correspondent. And some outstanding people, Kalpana Sharma, Daryl De Monte, Usha Rai, Rajkumar Keswani, who wrote in Hindi and broke the Bhopal story, in Kannada, Nagesh Hegde, extraordinary writers. Now, by the 2000s, they were invisible. Either the environmental correspondent had either been laid off by their newspapers or redesignated stock market correspondent. So that was the kind of, so liberalization, as I said, I am not an old-fashioned socialist. License, permit, quota, Raj had to be dismantled. But the one area in which some safeguards had to be retained properly was to do with environmental sustainability. But environmentalists were painted as bad guys. So when I started my research in the early 80s, the Cold War was on. India was allied to the Soviet Union, a little bit. So environmentalists were called CIA agents. By the 2000s, they became KGB agents. Right. Now, this is the kind of pendulum which environmentalism swung. Now, let me say a little bit about climate change and then move on to my concluding remarks. Even as the domestic environmental situation deteriorates, both in terms of the physical attacks on the environment and the social dispersal causes, in the delegitimizing of environmental activism, however non-violent it may be, I mean, a person who's faced the most vicious and hate-filled demonization is Medha Patkar, but there are others too, the Kerala Fisher Folk leaders and so on and so forth. Even as that happened, there is, at another level, in the cities, a growing awareness about the global climate change crisis, which is clearly visible. And there's a shift in focus for activism and for science. I suppose that's where all the money is for scientific research, right? Climate change. Right? So you have to have climate somewhere and you'll get a grant done. But even in terms of activism, that's where young people go. Because they see it, it's stark and visible. You have iconic global figures like Greta Thunberg to inspire you. And that's all very good and admirable. And one of the significant changes, positive changes between the urban youth, educated urban youth of my time and the educated urban youth today is that they are much more aware, alert about the environmental crisis, although it's largely connected with climate change and not really with the domestic environmental situation. And I'm going to end my talk with some remarks on some broad conclusions on the environmental situation in India today. And I'm going to offer to you 5 theses on the Indian environmental scenario today, from the perspective of someone who has been, one way or the other, a student of the subject for all his working life. The first thesis is as follows. Even if climate change did not exist, India would be an environmental disaster zone. I repeat, even if climate change did not exist, India would be an environmental disaster zone. So consider some of the major environmental problems we face today. Air pollution, where, I don't know what it is now, what it will be in October, 16 out of 20 most polluted cities in the world will be in northern and western India. It has nothing to do with climate change. Take the death of our rivers. Historically, all our major cities, pre-colonial and colonial, and indeed even Bangalore was cyclone rivers, our rivers are biologically dead. Nothing to do with climate change. Contamination of the soil, nothing to do with climate change. Depletion of aquifers, nothing to do with climate change. Degradation of biodiversity, invasion of some of our best natural forests by exotic weeds, nothing to do with climate change. All these massive, multifaceted environmental problems are occurring independent of climate change, and they're the result of faulty economic policies followed by successive governments. Second, so my second thesis, these varied forms of environmental abuse adversely affect the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of Indians. So air pollution affects a large swathe of the population of our cities. The depletion of aquifers undermines farming, subsistence and commercial farming in states across India, the contamination of the soil, the impacts of that and so on. So they adversely affect, they have economic costs on the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of Indians, at least half our population, if not more. And these costs of pollution and degradation are borne disproportionately by the poor. We can have our air filters and our bottled water and so on and so forth. Right? That's my second thesis. My third thesis is that though these multiple environmental problems are occurring autonomously, independent of climate change intensifies their impact. It is a deadly add-on to a problem that already exists. If you look at our two most important mountain chains, the Western Ghats and the Himalaya. Without climate change, we have unregulated mining, unscientific road building, reckless expansion of tourism, etc., etc. And then you have, so that's already causing deforestation, soil degradation, depletion of water sources. And then you have these unprecedented weather effects. And, in the case of the Himalaya, the decline of glaciers, and it's an add-on. So it's a deadly add-on. It's like, you could say, in a sense, it makes the problem much, much worse. That's thesis number 3. Thesis number 4, which was formulated before I saw these 300 scientists and potential scientists in this room, but was formulated several years ago based on my personal experience, is this: that while in the 70s and even 80s, Harini was here and said when CES started, there were 20 ecological scientists in India. When I started my work a few years before CES, I was the sole environmental historian in India. There was no environmental economist, there was no environmental sociologist, etc., etc. However, 40 years on or 50 years on from Chipko, there is now a vast reservoir of scientific and social scientific expertise available within India itself that can help mitigate the human costs of such environmentally insensitive development. The countries, and this is a point alluded to in your previous column, the sheer depth, diversity, and demographic robustness of scientists, and I would add to that social scientists too, working in the environmental field. The country's universities and research institutes have first-rate ecologists, sociologists, economists, agronomists, hydrologists, urban planners, transport and energy experts, etc., who combine professional expertise of an international standard with deep field experience of social and environmental conditions within India itself, which did not exist all through my first 2 decades as an environmental researcher. And certainly even today do not, this depth of talent, this depth and robustness and diversity of scientific and social scientific talent in the ecological and environmental field probably does not exist in any other country in Asia. Maybe China, but I kind of doubt it. Certainly not when it comes to the social sciences. Right? So that's thesis number 4. And thesis number 5 is to complicate and darken the picture, is that these domain experts are rarely consulted by politicians in power. And even if they are, their proposals are never implemented or rarely implemented. And again, This disregard for environmental sustainability of Indian politicians is ecumenical. It operates across parties. Now, if you look at, again, since this is a CES show, look at the fate of Professor Madhav Gadgil's Western Ghats report. Every state government has rejected. So, the Communists of Kerala, the Congress in Karnataka, the DMK in Tamil Nadu, the BJP in Goa, Maharashtra, Gujarat, all mock it, knock it. They haven't yet called Professor Gadgil, the name is Mira, they called Mira Patkar, but that may still be coming. May yet be coming. So, these domain experts, of whom there are many, diverse and extremely competent, are rarely consulted by politicians. But this disregard is ecumenical. It is the product of ignorance as well as malevolence. And I should explain this. On the one hand, these politicians are, to invoke John Maynard Keynes, slaves of the idea of out-of-date economists, who themselves have no understanding of ecology at all. On the other hand, Indian politicians across parties are beholden to the mining magnates, infrastructure developers, and factory owners who fund their election campaigns. It must also be acknowledged that the seductions of unending economic growth and ever-increasing consumerism have captured the imagination of the Indian middle class. From their perspective, environmentalists, which probably include ecologists as well, are not merely meddlesome busybodies, but possibly also agents of Western powers paid to keep India underdeveloped. Now, it will take a long longer lecture, and by someone, an environmental historian more qualified than me, to explain why the global replication of European and American patterns of consumerism, particularly, is absolutely impossible. You can read, if you wish, the works of two great American historians, John McNeill and Donald Wooster, on this subject. But very briefly, why India has still to find a way of, I'll come to this in a minute. But from this kind of overview of the history of Indian environmentalism over the last 50 years, I'd like to suggest that today is an absolutely critical time for the environment development debate in India. We cannot replicate conventional, standard, energy-intensive, resource-intensive, consumerist-oriented models of development, basically for three reasons. One is our higher population densities. A second is our more fragile ecologies. The tropical ecologies are much more fragile. And thirdly, because as Gandhi said 100 years ago, we have no colonies to conquer. And by we, I mean China too. If we do want to, as we are, then we'll set up a scramble for Africa, as China is doing, or we'll brutalize sections of our own society, as China has done in Tibet and Xinjiang, and as we are doing to the tribals of central India and the vulnerable regions of the northeast. So it is just physically impossible for ecological, demographic, and political reasons. At the same time, we have to assure the basic needs of the bulk of our population. So the real question is, how does one assure a secure and dignified life to Indians now living? How does one assure a secure and dignified life to Indians now living without undermining the interests and needs of future generations, indeed the interests and needs of nature itself? And that's a question I leave to these wonderful young scientists in this room. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah, sure it is.
Sir, I have a small question. It's about hobby.
Yeah.
Hobby, especially bird watching.
Yeah.
Don't you think bird watching contributed to developing manpower and scientists of the future? I particularly know of one young 11-year-old who wrote an article on bird watching and later went on to become the first Indian historian and ecology.
Oh, Krishna is being mischievous here. My first published piece.
What about Indira Gandhi? Was she a bird watcher? And was it during her time that the wildlife conservation act was?
No, obviously,
Bird watching, especially bird watching. Why did you not mention it?
although my first published article was on bird watching as a little boy, I think because it said 10 years old, Zafar Fateh Ali published it. I then became more interested in human beings than in.
And went to the governing letter of Dr. George who started bird watching.
Anyway, I'd say, of course, it could be. It could be, as long as that leads to a more expansive view of nature, both the diversity of nature, the place of humans in nature. So long as it doesn't become counting how many species have you seen and with the aid of what kind of fancy apps. Right. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk, especially followed and juxtaposed with the panel that happened. I'm curious about values.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, deciding that we want to do research for the sake of curiosity, someone enacting their values. Wanting to build a mind is again enacting values. A community driven enough by their values to do the Chipko movement and then others joining them. So, leaving aside sort of disciplinarity, policy, science, or community work, what can we do to help shape the values of the next generation? As a historian, this is.
I'd say this. So, a historian cannot predict,
Yes.
and a historian must not prescribe. One of the advantages of living in Bangalore and not Delhi is that you're rarely likely to be called upon to become a Rajguru. Right. But having said that, I'd say what a historian tells you, which may be close to ecology. I think ecology is more multifaceted than other sciences and has a more holistic view and I may be transgressing to areas I don't know and the physicists may excuse me, but it's probably more multi-causal. Right. Now, Sundarlal Bahuguna, who was a very charismatic leader himself, thought all that matters was values. Okay. Now, I think we have to operate at different levels. Science, technology, innovation has a place. Values have a place. And political change, by which I certainly don't mean revolutionary political change, but a greater focus towards decentralization. I think if the 73rd and 74th amendments were properly enacted in the spirit in which they were forged, we would have a much more ecologically stable, secure, and socially inclusive economy. Right. Say my new book, Speaking with Nature, which is largely set in the 19th and early 20th centuries, ends with a visit to Gadchiroli. Now, the new government of Maharashtra, it's currently a BJP government, but it could be a Congress government, has said we'll make a steel mill to Gadchiroli. Who is that going to help? When I was in Bastar 20 years ago doing field work, I was with a group consisting of some scholars and journalists and a very remarkable, absolutely remarkable IAS officer called EAS Sarma from Andhra Pradesh. I don't know whether anybody here has heard of him. And he told the leaders there, the Chhattisgarh leaders, he said, enact the 5th schedule. I'm not opposed to mining. But if there's a mine, there are provisions in the 5th schedule in which first you take the permission of the local villages. If you get it, you can make them stakeholders. But what is the situation today? The state government or the central government can usurp the land and hand it over to any crony capitalist they want. Again, if you look at things like water, I am old enough to remember what it was like in the few years when there was a Janta government with Ramakrishna Hegde as chief minister and Abdul Nazir Saab as rural development minister, and how decentralization brought water security to drought-prone areas of North Karnataka. So, political change, value change, and technological change are all vital. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for the insightful talk. So, the problem of politicians not paying attention to environmentalists, I think, was also recognized in the West. And we had, from the West Coast, we had, these ideas around financialization of nature, this field of economics of biodiversity being born. So, environmentalists speaking the language of economy.
Yes.
So, do you think some of that has also in India, has that resonated in India?
It's a very good question. So, to absolutely some extent, it has. So, we do have some very good young ecological economists, including some working in this city. There is a network called SANDI, which you might be aware of, the South Asian Network of Development, Environment and Economics. So, we have again at that level expertise. However, there are two problems which impede not just the growth of ecological economics, but the adoption of its insights into policy. There are two obstacles. The first obstacle is that the senior economists don't care. The more prestigious economists are not there. You know, Amartya Sen is not there, Jagdish Bhagwati is not there. They're as ecological because they believe in unending economic growth and expanding production prosperity frontier, and so that kind of thing is not. You know, they've not had a Madhav Gadgil among them to kind of right. That's one. The other thing is to do with this whole issue of an excessive focus on climate change, which is why I emphasized that even if climate change did not exist, India would be an environmental basket case. You know, it is absolutely true that the West has been totally hypocritical when it comes to climate change. Again, perhaps the first person to point this out were Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan 35 years ago in their pamphlet, Global Warming in an Unequal World. And the West has been absolutely, and the Americans more so. In fact, I can explain to you why, if you give me 2 minutes, why Al Gore is the greatest enemy of climate change mitigation, historically. A historian, that by historian judgment, because when he was in power, he did nothing. All the European countries were willing to come on board and sign the Kyoto Protocol. Right. Now he can, when he campaigned for president in 2000, he never mentioned environment. And so on and so forth. After he lost, he became a born-again environmentalist. So the Western governments have been extremely hypocritical, right? They have not transferred technology, they have not used funding, they've taken too long to agree on commitments, and they go back on them, like President Trump now, reneging on the Paris Agreement. But this obvious and shameful hypocrisy has been cynically used by Indian politicians to say it's all climate change and to be not attend to the domestic problems they cause. So I think these are, but you're absolutely right that, and as Anita was also saying in the earlier panel, that there has to also be an economic approach. And it may slowly come. You know, if Indian Eleanor Ostrom wins the Nobel Prize for Economics, that may help.
Yeah, good evening, sir. So lovely to listen out to you. And I'm really, I think I would call myself a student of everything because I've studied science in University of Delhi and after that an MBA. And right now I'm looking for a new direction, and having born in Chhattisgarh, Bastar region, I come from a tribal community there. I'm choosing my next phase of life in Chhattisgarh. I really need a direction on how can I contribute into ecology. I've only come as a very curious student out here.
I said a historian can't be a Rajguru, but email me. My email is a public domain. I'll put you in touch with a couple of wonderful anthropologists working in Boston, and they'll give you the right advice. So email me and I'll reply to you.
Last question, I think, over there.
Hi. This is more of a contradicting point that I have in my mind. So, Betsy Darcy's book came in 1962, sometime 60 years ago, right? And she talks about the impact on environment of mostly the pesticide, how it is an environmental hazard. And I believe it is kind of the condition of India today. All those hazards are in our country and we are not really...
You just stand up, I'm slightly hard again. So exactly, yeah.
So now we are facing somewhat similar environmental hazards and we are not really focused on that.
Yeah.
There's one example I would like to give. One of my seniors who is a researcher at Bias, which is the topmost company of pesticides. So they developed a pesticide 10 years ago. They found their hazards and they banned the production. The company was in millions of dollars, but they were able to afford it.
same compound developed by an Indian company recently, and they're selling it like crazy. And a company which was at the verge of extinction is now making so much money. They are sending their employees abroad. So that just makes me think that maybe we are at some level too poor to take care of our
No.
environment.
No, we're not too poor. We lack robust, transparent, efficient, and incorruptible institutions. So this is an area in which we can learn from the West. You're right. This is an area in which we can learn from the West. You know, when Silent Spring came out, and there were other scientists. I just mentioned Rachel Carson, but another wonderful book you should read from the 70s by Barry Commoner called The Closing Circle, which also talks about some of these synthetic chemical issues. And then in the West, you also had much more robust local government. So the city government, the cantons, I mean, they were still devastating Congo in search of minerals, and all of that was going on, right? That kind of imperialism was going on, and of course, accumulating greenhouse gases because of their fetish with the motor car. But when it came to clean water, clean soil, they had more robust pollution control mechanisms in place. So open, transparent, efficient, scientifically robust, and incorruptible public institutions. You know, it's a very tall order, but we can slowly move towards that. And that's whether it's not that we are too poor, we are too corrupt.
I've been told. No, I've been told there's a societal gender bias in who gives bouquets and gifts to guests. So at CES, at least, we're trying to correct that. Thank you. So this sort of brings us to the end of today. Thank you, Ram, for a wonderful talk.